Welcome to the Deep Faith Podcast, the show where we bridge the gap between ancient biblical truth and modern life with clarity, confidence, and honesty. I'm your host, Katy and I'm a pastor and a Bible teacher here to help you study Scripture to discover its true meaning. We'll talk about passages and topics that have often been misused, misinterpreted, or misrepresented and have left many of us feeling disenchanted with the church, disconnected from God, and distrusting of the Bible altogether. Each week we'll learn how to actually read and interpret the Bible using things like original languages, cultural customs, and historical context in order to read Scripture as it was intended so that we can recapture a wonder for who God is and all that He wants to do. So grab your Bibles, refill your coffee, and come with me as we discover deep faith. Well, welcome back, scholars. We are in our fourth installment of a series examining what the Bible says about a woman's role within the leadership of the church, and today we're going to look at a passage that pretty audaciously says that women shouldn't teach or have authority over a man. At least that's how it reads at face value. But in this episode, we will look at the original language, the culture, and the context around 1 Timothy chapter 2 that seems to give these harsh directives to women about not having the authority to teach in the church. But I think we're going to be surprised at what is really going on, because there's a few questions that we are going to be answering today, like, does the Apostle Paul exclude women from church leadership entirely? Do women really just have to sit submissively silent to all men? What the heck is Paul saying about the significance of childbirth? And what does that have to do with anything? And let me give you just a quick forewarning. This will probably be my longest episode yet. There is a lot of context here in order to make all of this make sense. And also, while we are honing in to make a case about just two specific verses from 1 Timothy chapter 2, I will be referencing many other portions of this book, because remember, these letters were meant to be read in long form, not as small parts and pieces. So at some point, when you are done listening today, you may want to take just 10 to 15 minutes and read through the entirety of the book of 1 Timothy, just so you have a full picture of the context of what is actually going on. Okay, so with that said, make sure that cup of coffee is extra full and extra strong today before we dive into this, because if you're drinking anything other than strong coffee, you're just doing life wrong, okay? Now, if you are a millennial woman like me who grew up in the church, I imagine that this is probably the passage that you are the most familiar with as well when it comes to what your place is in the church. In the churches I grew up in, this passage was often linked as well to sexuality or to like purity culture. If you're unfamiliar with purity culture, then you escaped a whole generation of very specific spiritual trauma, and I am very happy for you in that regard. But it's true, this passage was often used to define a woman's sexual purity and linked that with her lack of authority within the church. I went to a church that took this passage in 1 Timothy so seriously that, as I shared a couple weeks ago, I couldn't even lead worship on stage unless I had a man up there with me, because that was considered teaching, and heaven forbid that I wear yoga pants while leading worship, okay? Again, if you avoided purity culture, good on you, okay? Although, what I found funny, again, is that women could lead Sunday school classes with little boys who grew up to be men one day, and that no one seemed to care about us having that kind of authority. So, I've got some questions about this passage today, and I think I've got some answers for us, and I think we're about to discover that this passage actually has a lot less to do with sexuality and a lot more to do with a false belief about who God was that was permeating the first century church. And the case that I'm going to propose to you today is that Paul is not giving this directive for women in all churches in all time periods to be silent, but is rather giving this directive to a specific group of women in a particular church for a very important reason, and that very little of it has to do with sexuality or purity culture like we were taught. So, we're going to go on quite a journey today through the ancient city of Ephesus, where we will explore its culture, history, pagan religions, and language, and hopefully be able to find some clues to really dissect what Paul is actually talking about here. Now, just a quick note of context, this book of the Bible is called 1 Timothy because it's Paul's first letter written to a guy named Timothy. Timothy is the leader over the church in Ephesus, which is in modern-day Turkey. The Roman Empire was in power, but there was also a lot of Greek influence that was permeating the city, and Greek and Roman culture was very similar to one another. And as with all of these New Testament letters, we are only getting to see one side of this conversation. Paul's letters throughout the New Testament are responses to situations, false teachings, and various people who are writing to him and asking him what to do. So Timothy has written some sort of letter to Paul, and what we are seeing is Paul's response to him throughout this book. So let's start by reading our so-called problem passage today. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 to 15. I also want women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate to the women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So like I said, this sounds pretty audacious to our modern sensibilities, and since we believe that the Bible is the inspired word of God, it also seems pretty audacious that a God who created all people and who blessed and gave authority to all people, as we learned in episode 2 of this series, would then not permit half of those people to be able to teach the word that he wants people to hear about and to hopefully receive. So the case that I want to make to you today is that Paul's words here are not directive to everyone and every church, but rather to the specific church in Ephesus because of what they are experiencing. So let's get to the bottom of this. I'm going to start building my case, as I usually do, by looking at some original language. We're going to look specifically at a few of the words used here and try to understand the original language that our author Paul uses. So the first two words I want to look at are quietness and silent, because these are the same Greek word in these verses. The word is hesukia, and it means stillness or desistance from bustle or language. In both instances of quietness and silent, Paul uses the feminine form of this word. Now remember, this is something that we don't have in English. We don't have a gendered language system to define objects and context of certain things and sentences, but the Greek language does. And Paul is speaking about and to women here, so he uses the feminine form of this word, which is hesyxia. Again, for those of you on YouTube, there will be screenshots up in the screenshots up for you audio listeners. It will be in the show notes for you to access later. But you can see here, the feminine version of this word is used to reference a God-produced calm, which includes an inner tranquility that supports appropriate action. This term does not mean speechlessness. So, Paul isn't using quietness and silent to mean speechlessness. He's not instructing women not to utter a word, but rather it says right here that he wants them to act with a calmness that comes from knowing God, which produces inner tranquility and appropriate action. So I want you to keep that tab in your brain open for a little bit, and we'll come back to it, okay? So another word that Paul uses is authority, or the word authenteo in the Greek. And this is the only instance where this particular word is used in the New Testament. Its literal definition is to act of oneself, and figuratively it means to dominate, or like in the photo on the screen, again in the show notes for you audio listeners, it equates to unilaterally taking up arms. acting as an autocrat or being self-appointed. This is essentially the same idea that we discussed in Genesis 3, where God said he will rule over you, like doling that curse out to the woman. It communicates this sense, in this instance, that the man is ruling over her in a social sense, dictating or defining what the woman was allowed to do or to act like or to be. And the Greek word here is communicating the same idea, using authority over someone as a self-appointed autocrat, taking absolutely no account of other people's wants or needs or opinions, desires, or wishes. And in Genesis, God said the consequence was that man would rule over woman in a social sense. And so Paul is using essentially the Greek equivalent for that same Hebrew idea here in 1 Timothy 2. It seems that he is actually forbidding women from using the same type of sinful authority from the curse of Genesis 3 that rules over others in a way that takes no account of their well-being or their God-given value. This is like new wave man-hater feminism, where women hate men and think that men are like of the devil and should cease to exist. And there are women out there who believe that. I know some of them. But Paul is condemning that belief in the same way that in our earlier episode from Genesis condemns that belief for women, or on behalf of women, that everyone should be equal. But it acknowledges the reality of living in a sinful world. So Paul is forbidding women to have that kind of authority, similarly to how in our last episode on marriage in Ephesians 5, that godly men are supposed to elevate women back to that place of equality. We see that women likewise are supposed to respect that men are of equal authority and equal partnership and equality with them. So Paul isn't telling women here to be silent in the sense of being speechless, as we saw, and as many people take literally from just reading the English, nor is he implying that a woman shouldn't have any position of authority over a man, rather that she is not to domineer over him in the way that men have traditionally domineered over women, outside of God's original creative order and in an oppressive manner, like we see from the curse in Genesis 3. So we are going to come back to the word submission at the very end of today. I'm not skipping it, and I'm not afraid of that word. We just have some work to do to get there to be able to understand what we're really talking about. So the case that I have to build for you again today is simply showing us why Paul is calling for the submission of women in this particular church at Ephesus. And I believe the reasons for Paul's directive to this specific church is because of a very curious cult that was causing problems for Paul's protege, Pastor Timothy. Now, here's a question that we have to ask. Why would Paul feel the need to address women having quietness and silence, or rather the calm spirit and appropriate action, in verses 9 through 11? Or maybe the better question, since remember, we're only seeing one side of the conversation, is what prompted young Pastor Timothy to ask Paul about how women should be behaving in his church? Okay, now, as always, we have to consider the culture surrounding the church of Ephesus and surrounding this letter where Timothy pastored in order to read the Bible in context. And we also have to have this foundation before we can understand Paul's third directive about forbidding women to teach. So we need to start today. We did some language. Now we need to look at some cultural context, because remember that what we're seeing here, again, is only one side of a two-sided conversation. So in order to understand this passage, we really need to do some work in understanding some of the situations that may have been going on in Ephesus during this time. Okay, now, I highly recommend first finishing this podcast, okay, and then jumping over to listen to one of my favorite podcasts called Theology in the Raw by Preston Sprinkle, who I referenced in our last episode as well. It will help you gain a lot more insight and understanding on this topic when I link 2 of those podcasts below. There are episodes there from Dr. Sandra Richter, who's one of my favorite scholars, and from Dr. Sandra Glahn. Again, both of those episodes are in the show notes, and I'm going to summarize some of their work and thoughts for us here today, so you'll hear me referencing them. But both of these incredible scholars say that Paul's instructions to not allow women to teach in verses 11 and 12 actually hinge on the context of what's happening culturally in verses 9 and 10 and in verses 13 to 15, with the directive squeezed in the middle of that context. And so from all the research I've done, I'm going to agree with them. So let me finally build my case for you, okay? At this time, the cult of Artemis was the prevailing religious group in Ephesus during the time of Paul and Timothy. Acts chapter 19 even makes this clear when a riot starts in Ephesus after Paul says that carved idols depicting Artemis made by human hands are not gods. That was apparently news to the people there. Okay, now Richter poses that in this passage to Timothy, Paul is not giving a directive to all churches for all times and cultures, but rather is addressing the specific problem that the church at Ephesus is facing in the pervasiveness of the Artemis cult and the false teachings that they were bringing to the church. If you're a fan of the Percy Jackson series, you may be familiar with Artemis, though she's probably explained a little more age appropriately in that series than what people actually thought she was. So those who believed in the teaching of the Greek goddess Artemis believed that she and her twin brother Apollo were born to the supreme god Zeus and his mistress Leto. Mythology holds that Leto gives birth to Artemis, who was born first, and then immediately upon her birth, Artemis turns around and begins helping her mother deliver her twin brother Apollo, though she was just a newborn herself. Okay, so this is why the Greeks claimed that Artemis was the goddess of childbirth and was the protector of women. So because of this, Artemis is considered preeminent over many of the other gods, and the Greeks believed that Artemis was the source of life, despite the fact that Artemis had taken a vow to be a perpetual virgin. Now, a lot of people tend to think the Artemis cult was kind of like a sex cult or like a prostitution ring, and that's not really the case, because again, Artemis was a perpetual virgin. She took that vow. Now, I think the Artemis cult gets the reputation of being a very sexualized cult because she was the goddess of fertility. And throughout history, many women who were cult members often did dress very elaborately, which often made them look like prostitutes enticing men to sleep with them. However, most scholars seem to agree that that was not necessarily the case for the cult of Artemis at large. There were maybe some factions that were very sexualized, but certainly did not represent the cult as kind of a widespread practice because, again, perpetual virginity, okay? However, these cults were typically run and led by women, and they had a very heavy female following. Not to say that men didn't join, that they weren't part of the cult, but this cult was primarily run by women who did often have elaborate braided hairstyles, who wore intricate robes and expensive jewelry, especially if they were of high leadership status within the cult itself. History actually records that the cult often preyed upon and exploited money from families of elite status who had money and who wanted to do some fertility rituals, maybe for their daughters or for their sons, so that they could secure an heir. And so I guess the thought in that case was maybe to dress for the job you want, which was why the ladies of this cult dressed as high society and were so elaborate. But paintings and carvings that exist of this cult show women who were very extravagantly dressed, who were decorated just to the nines with some expensive jewelry. Okay, now, additionally, When you consider that in his book, The Early Church, Ray Vanderlyn notes that the cult of Artemis often worshipped in a way that was also chaotic, with loud chants, with dramatic presentations and expressions. You kind of get even more context as to what Paul might be talking about, that these gatherings of worship of Artemis always sounded like they were absolute chaos, and these women were loud and they wailed when they gathered together. And so now in verse 9, when Paul says, I also want women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. I think all of this historical proof and context provides some evidence for my case that Paul isn't giving a directive to all people, but to this specific group of women in the church of Ephesus, and that he's putting parameters around how Christian women were to act and dress in order to distinguish themselves as followers of Jesus from these women who would have been participating in the cult of Artemis. So Christian women were not supposed to put opulence and wealth on display through their clothing or their hair or their jewelry, but rather they were supposed to have the hesychia spirit that called them to a type of well-ordered, calm-spirited life that a person of God should have and should pursue. That a woman of God should be known for her modesty of her good deeds and not of her wealth. And so that's one piece of cultural context that we need to have a full understanding of exactly what is going on here in the broader picture of 1 Timothy chapter 2. But to fully understand what Paul says specifically about women in the church in verses 11 and 12, we're actually going to have to skip those verses for just a moment, and we're going to look at verses 13 to 15 for even more cultural context. So let's read those verses again, just for a quick refresher. 1 Timothy 2, 13 through 15. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Again, some really interesting statements here that Paul is making, saying that women should be silent because it was Eve who sinned first. But again, is Paul talking to all women? And then he says that women will be saved through childbearing. Does Paul mean that literally? Is a woman's salvation through having children, or does it make her faith more real? Because that's what Paul is making it sound like. But then that poses the question of, what about women who never get married? What about women who physically cannot have children? What would they do in that case? So Paul, what the heck are you talking about, man? Well, we get to learn even more cultural context. So let's discuss another false ideology that was pervasive at this time and seems to play a role into some of the other things Paul is addressing in this passage. Around the same time that Christian teaching had made its way into Ephesus in the first century ancient world, Gnosticism was also on the rise. And this belief system had to do with the thirst for an idea of kind of ultimate knowledge. Gnosticism, in its most basic form, was the belief that everything of the material world is inherently evil, and that the path to freedom was to attain a vast spiritual knowledge. So, for example, they believed that Jesus was not God, but was more like a divine emissary or an ambassador to bring more spiritual truth to the people. The Greeks often intertwined their belief in the Greek gods with their belief in Gnosticism and put them together. And this is where things get really fascinating, because many who practiced within the Artemis cult and held to Gnosticism at the same time did not agree with Christian teaching from Genesis chapters 1 through 3 when it comes to the idea of sinfulness. Genesis 1 through 3 teaches that Eve committed a sin by disobeying God when she ate the fruit in the garden from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Rather, the Gnostics argued that Eve did the wise thing by seizing the power of the spiritual knowledge that was made available to her. And the Gnostics within the cult of Artemis saw this as being like sort of an act of liberation, since Eve made it possible for both her and Adam to be spiritually enlightened to the whole world, or as Genesis teaches, to be like God, knowing good and evil, as the serpent told her in Genesis chapter 3. So instead of believing that she was being confined by the material or physical body, Eve was actually spiritually enlightened by eating the fruit. Okay, now, this obviously is not the Christian belief of the story of Genesis. Christians believe that God created humanity to be with him, created them a garden to live in, and put a tree in the middle of the garden called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God said that the humans could eat of any tree in the garden except for that one tree, but then that serpent comes, he tempts human beings, and he tells them that if they eat it, then they will be like God. Now Eve takes the apple and she eats, and she gives it to Adam, who was also there, and he eats. And it's with this act of disobedience that sin enters the world, and that God's whole world is then fractured by evil and by sinfulness. Adam and Eve aren't just suddenly in this mode of spiritual transcendence like the Gnostics believed, but rather they are separated from God's presence, and they give themselves over to sin and to evil desires. And so it seems a bit strange that Paul would need to address the Christian and the Jewish belief of Genesis, especially since Timothy was ethnically Jewish. He was also Greek, but he was Jewish and probably would have known the scriptures, especially the book of Genesis, because that was a common book for the Jews to know and have memorized. And it also seems strange to me that Paul felt it necessary to mention that Adam was formed first and then Eve, and that Eve was the one who was deceived and who became a sinner. Again, some of the seasoned Christians helping lead this church would have already known that that was the belief, okay? But I also find it interesting that Paul talks about Adam and Eve several different times throughout his writings, but he doesn't always mention that Eve was the one who sinned. In fact, in Romans chapter 5, Paul specifically refers to sin entering the world through Adam, and in that specific instance, he is using it to show that while sin may have entered the world through Adam, righteousness entered the world through Jesus Christ. And whenever something is repeated like that in the Bible, like Paul repeats talking about Adam and Eve in several writings, we should always ask, why is this being repeated this time? So where Adam is compared to Christ, we now have Eve with sinfulness and childbirth. So why does Paul say in one place that sin entered the world through Eve, and in another one he's saying that sin entered it through Adam, but that Christ was the second Adam to redeem us from sin? Why does he direct this discourse in 1 Timothy at Eve, as though he has to make clear to the church at Ephesus that Adam was formed first and that Eve was the one who sinned? And why is this the only time when Paul references Adam and Eve that he felt the need to address the fact that Adam was formed before Eve was? He didn't mention that in any of his other writings about Adam and Eve. So what is the significance of that statement if Paul doesn't address it anywhere else in his New Testament writings? Again, theologian Sandy Richter says that the only rational response is that since this is Paul's letter in response to Timothy and the Ephesian church, that someone in the church must be teaching that Adam was not formed first and that Eve did not sin. And this actually tracks with the pervading belief of the Artemis cult, which claimed that Artemis is the giver, the source of life, that Artemis came before Apollo and therefore was the giver of life, and held the belief that women were born first and that women were preeminent over men. This is the belief of the Artemis cult. And so if you pair this with the Gnostic belief that Eve's actions were not sinful, but actually spiritually enlightening, then we arrive at Paul's need to address that it was Adam who was formed first by God, that woman was made from the man's rib, and that it was in fact Eve who sinned because she ate the fruit, allowing sin to enter this world. So I believe that what we see in all of this is Paul correcting the Ephesians theology in order to set straight a pervasive false teaching that was entering the church through this cult. Okay, now I know that was a lot, but stick with me because there is actually much more to be said here. Because understanding all of this leads to verse 15, where Paul says that women will be saved through childbearing, but only if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. There are several important points to be made here. Okay, first, the belief of the cult of Artemis that we just discussed, which Paul is trying to dispel, actually connects this verse to his statement earlier in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 4, where Paul writes that the church was not to devote themselves to endless genealogies. There's another scholar named Marge Mosko, I think that's how you say it, who speaks to these endless genealogies, and she says they're often better known as eons, which is essentially a measure of geologic time. And these measures of time were being practiced by the Gnostics in order to try to find a link between their gods and humanity. So the Gnostics put a lot of emphasis on genealogies, trying to find the intersection point between human and between divine. And with all that said, I find it very ironic that they couldn't bring themselves to believe that Jesus was God who stepped into humanity. But who knows? Who am I to say what the Gnostics should believe, right? Anyways, so because this was so common practice amongst the Gnostics, Paul instructs the Ephesians to not devote themselves to the same practice of tracking endless genealogies, trying to define that point because Jesus already came. Okay, now remember, we always have to interpret the part based on the whole, and remember, it wasn't the original writers who added these titles and chapters. These letters were meant to be read as a whole unit. So I think if Paul were addressing this Gnostic teaching back in chapter 1 of this book, then I think there's a strong case to be made that he is also addressing this false belief here in chapter 2. And this is what I believe the evidence shows us. That when Paul writes 1 Timothy 2:15, talking about women being saved through childbearing, he isn't giving a directive to all women or tying our salvation to childbirth, but instead he is addressing a false theology in which the Gnostics believe that all of life began with Artemis. But Paul is showing them that life itself actually began with Eve, the first woman who was created by God, who does actually have a traceable genealogy, and that is the true origin of all of human life. And my favorite part of this whole thing is that for as enlightened as the Gnostics claim to be, they apparently forgot that Artemis was born as a baby to her mother Leto. So why is Artemis considered the origin of life when she was born to another woman? It make sense. The math ain't mathing, okay? There is also the fact that she asked her father Zeus for the gift of perpetual virginity, so she was not bound to marriage or to childbearing, which makes all of the Greek and Gnostic belief of Artemis even more ironic, since she would have never given birth to anyone. I don't know. Like, people say that Christians are crazy for believing the Bible. I think that's pretty crazy. Maybe they're just more spiritually enlightened than I am. You tell me, okay? Now, there is one more piece to verse 15 here that I think really rounds out and really solidifies our case for what Paul is speaking to in verse 15. When Paul says that women will be saved through childbearing, he uses the Greek word which actually articulates two ideas. One usage of the word means deliver from the penalties of messianic judgment. Okay, so you're being saved, you're being delivered from God's judgment. This is how it's used in the Old Testament book of Joel chapter 2, for example, okay? But it's the second idea of this word that Paul actually communicates in 1 Timothy 2:15, where it means to save from the evils which obstruct the reception of messianic deliverance. Or more simply put, you are saved from the things that prevent you from belief in Jesus. So for anyone, but especially the women in Ephesus, to put their belief in the endless genealogies of the Gnostics or in Artemis as the source of life and humanity would naturally keep them from believing in the truth of who Jesus was as the Messiah. So these women who are leaving the practice of Artemis will be saved through childbearing because it means that they have truly decided to give up the belief of the cult of Artemis, that perpetual virginity is the way to life, and that they have now come to Christ and come under obedience to the God-given design for life to fill the earth and to multiply. Okay, now to be clear, I don't think it means that women who don't or who didn't or couldn't have children weren't carrying out their God-given ideal or that they weren't saved. Okay, that's definitely not the point that Paul is trying to make. You can be obedient to God's design for life and never marry and never have kids, to be very clear about that. But rather, what Paul is emphasizing is what it looks like for these particular women in Ephesus to exercise a true obedience to Jesus in giving up their former belief system. So really it seems that's what is happening, as we saw in verses 9 and 10 and now in 13 through 15, is that Paul is communicating that the women of Ephesus must leave behind any belief that is tied to Artemis and tied to the Gnostics if they are going and professing to be true believers of Jesus, which includes dressing modestly and displaying godly behavior through your actions, your clothing, and your lifestyle, as he says in verses 9 and 10, and by having the correct belief about who God is as the giver of life and his created order of the world in verses 13 through 15. All right, we've already done a lot of work on this passage, but I think there are a few more things that are important to note here, okay? Because in 1 Timothy 5, Paul also gives some instructions to the widows in Ephesus. And this may seem like a weird thing to reference here, but remember, these letters were meant to be read in long form. They were one fluid idea most of the time. And so, again, what I'm about to present does matter to the case that we're building about what Paul said about women being pastors and elders. So in 1 Timothy chapter 5, jumping ahead, verses 9 through 10, Paul instructs that no woman can be considered a widow unless she is over the age of 60. And in verses 11 through 15, he says that young widows should remarry. This is a very different command compared to the one that he gives in 1 Corinthians 7 and 8, where he specifically instructs widows of any age to stay single in honoring God and doing the work of ministry solely for the Lord. So why does Paul seem to contradict his own instructions to widows between his writing in 1 Timothy and his writing in 1 Corinthians? Okay, well, first, I think Paul's different instructions to the widows at Corinth versus the one in Ephesus prove that these writings are not things that are prescribed to all people in all times, in all cultures, everywhere, but that they are written to specific churches in specific times and situations. Otherwise, I think his instructions would have been the same to both sets of widows. So I feel like that one probably goes without saying. Secondly, scholar Sandra Glahn notes that the word widow in Greek simply means a woman without a husband. It doesn't necessarily mean that her husband had died like we tend to think of it, although that can be the case, which again is why language is important. So when we consider that the Artemis cult was made up primarily of women who dedicated themselves to perpetual virginity, then I think Paul's intentions behind his instructions for widows in 1 Timothy becomes a bit more clear. It seems that in this particular case, he is likely addressing the virgin women who would have been without husbands using the word widow, which is why he encourages young widows of Ephesus to get married. This makes even more sense in 1 Timothy 5:13, where Paul is addressing the problem of these young women who go house to house to gossip and to be idle. Glahn again notes that the word gossip in Greek actually means like spreading a false ideology. We just tend to think of it as like talking poorly about someone, talking behind their back, which can be true. And it's kind of the same thing. You're spreading a false ideology about that person. Okay, so that's the idea, is gossip is spreading a false ideology. You're spreading a falsehood about someone, and in this case, these widows or young unmarried women of Artemis were spreading false ideas about Jesus and about Christianity as they idly gossiped from house to house. And she explains that this is like the idea that they're going door to door, like they're proselytizing. They're trying to sell extended warranties, right? They were trying to evangelize the message of Artemis. And so Paul is urging these young women to leave behind the false ideology of perpetual virginity from Artemis and become women of God's purpose who work to restore God's creative ideal in Genesis by partnering with a husband for the equal work of multiplication and stewardship. Now, again, to be clear, I'm not saying that you can't do that if you aren't married. It's just that that is what Paul is saying when he is addressing these women in the context that they're in, which is why Paul's command was for the young widows to marry, but that a woman can be considered a widow and thus cared for financially by the church only if she is over the age of 60 and has a proven track record of faithfulness to her husband, indicating that she was then in fact a true widow whose husband had died, and that she is known for her godly character, as Paul writes in chapter 5, 9, and 10. Okay, but wait, there's more. There really is one more thing to address here in Paul's writing to Timothy before we circle all the way back around to our original problem verses. Okay, let's talk about the piece de resistance. My husband speaks French and he would have hated that. What Paul writes in 1 Timothy 3 about the position of elder of the church being limited to men, he says things like he must be married, he must lead his family well, deacons or elders of the church must be faithful to one wife. Okay, these are all very good ways to live, but this does sound like Paul is limiting the office of pastor and elder to men. So what does he mean here? Okay, well, at this time, men were a part of the Artemis cult, but the women spreading these false doctrines were far more pervasive, which makes sense considering all that we have already talked about. Hence, Paul's instruction to exclude women from the teaching of the word and leading in the church of Ephesus. This false ideology was pervasive primarily among the women of Ephesus, but not so much among the men in the city or in the church. And so this also brings understanding to his instructions in chapter 3 that elders of the church in Ephesus are also to be trustworthy men who meet very specific requirements, that there's a bit more safety around having men in Ephesus in leadership within the church because the probability of their belief in Artemis coming through male leadership for this church was much less likely, and hence also his instruction that they are to be a husband of one wife. They would be married, not a part of Artemis's ideology, okay? Woo-wee. All right, so when we stack all of this evidence on top of each other with a female-led cult, with beliefs about perpetual virginity, the weaving of Gnosticism with the Greek gods, how the cult dressed and behaved, how the young women of the cult refused to marry out of false belief, and how they went door to door spreading this false ideology. And I'm sure there are other facets and facts that I have missed here because we've talked about a lot of them today. But when we take all of that evidence about the surrounding historical and cultural context of the city of Ephesus into consideration, when we stack it all together, then when we go back and read our problem passage in 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 15, it says a woman should learn, and this is particularly 9 and 10, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. I really believe that what we see is that Paul is not excluding all women from being teachers, leaders, or elders in the church, but rather it just applies to these women in the church at Ephesus. These women were the primary perpetrators of false doctrine, of chaos, of opulent and chaotic living. They brought in all these ideas to steer people away from the saving message of Jesus and his gospel, which is why Paul now calls these women to submit to the leadership of the men in the church, because Paul is seemingly trying to help Timothy bring an organized structure to the church in order to fight this false doctrine. And unfortunately for Ephesus, this meant that at this time they had to exclude women from the leadership in this church so that they could protect the sanctity of the Christian doctrine and the Christian community, since Christianity was just beginning to find its foothold there in the ancient world. And so, no, based on reading the Bible in its full context with the original language, the history, the culture, I don't believe that Paul is banning all women like myself from being pastors and leaders of the church, that he's calling these women at Ephesus to submit to the men because of their previous track record of false ideology. Okay, but as always, I hope you don't just take my word for it. I want you to really read this for yourself. I want you to do your own research. I want you to take it all to heart. But from the evidence that I have presented today and the evidence that's still yet to come in our next couple episodes, especially in the last episode of this series, I simply cannot arrive at the fact that Paul is excluding all women from the work of pastoring and teaching and eldership within the local church. And I believe that misunderstanding the context of this passage, not looking into history, and misinterpreting some of the original language has caused this passage to be misunderstood and to exclude half of the church from ministry that God may have for them. So that's why I always say, study the Bible for yourself. Okay, now again, you can also find Sandy Richter's and Sandra Glahn's books and their resources and their podcasts in the show notes. You can find them at my Amazon link. We've got 2 episodes left in this series. I'm very excited for them. We're going to keep building this case about why the Bible actually says women can and should be pastors. And our passage next week comes from 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 35. So you have some time to read that and to research on your own. But until then, if you were encouraged by anything today, if you were challenged to want to read scripture more, if you have come to a place where you are starting to ask some questions, then I would love if you would give this show a 5-star review on your preferred platform. And if you would share it with a friend so that they can know that the real truth of Scripture is what leads us to deep faith. Thanks for listening to the Deep Faith Podcast. If today's episode encouraged you, challenged you, or helped you see your faith in a new light, then I'd love for you to subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave a review. And to support the show and access bonus content, including exclusive interviews, live Q&As, and much, much more, subscribe to my Patreon with the link in the show notes below for as little as $5 a month. And don't forget to follow along on YouTube or on socials at Deep Faith Pod for more reflections and resources throughout the week. We'll see you next time.